So I'm really excited to introduce you to our esteemed panel, and we're going to dig into those aspects of what is the IRA and the IIJA still able to do in this political environment. And Jay, I think you have probably some good insights for us to share.
Yeah. Yes, I'm Jay Turner. I'm a professor at Wellesley College, and kind of my entry point here is I'm a historian. I wrote a book in 2022 that looked at the history of batteries and asked, how can that help us think about this battery-powered future that we're headed towards? And a spinoff from that is right as I was finishing up the book, I started spending a lot of time just noticing that there we go. Whoop, sorry, I'm going to go back. Now I'm situated. But right as I was finishing this book, I realized there were so many press releases coming out about new battery projects, billion-dollar investments, lots of jobs, and I just started to feel overwhelmed. I couldn't keep up. And so with some students at Wellesley College, we started tracking this, just trying to keep track of everything that was happening. And this was all before the Inflation Reduction Act. And so when the Inflation Reduction Act came out, as a historian, and what really stood out to me as I started to get my mind around how significant a piece of climate and energy legislation this was, is that it looks different than kind of other efforts. And it's a really different piece of policy than the other efforts we've seen to address climate and energy over the last 2 decades. And specifically, right, it was all about carrots with very few sticks. And that was about providing subsidies and incentives both to consumers, but also to the manufacturing industry. And so just one, that this was not about a tax. It wasn't about cap and trade, right? If you remember back to Waxman, Markey, and those debates in 2010, it was about carrots, right? That really distinguishes the strategy of the Inflation Reduction Act. The other thing that stands out is that it was a really strategic approach to encouraging investment in the industry. It was about opportunity, building opportunity, and doing this in a way that was about investing in manufacturing and onshoring that manufacturing, bringing it back to the United States. So about carrots, strategic investment. I think the third way that it was different is that it was about global competitiveness and a new way for climate policy. Right up until this point, the concern had been, well, if the U.S. adopted a carbon tax, or if the U.S. went with cap and trade, we'd be too far out in front, right? Developing countries, China, they're not doing that. We wouldn't want to get too far out in front of China on this. And the Inflation Reduction Act was really a realization that we weren't out in front, right? We're playing catch up to China, right? And so that's another way that the Inflation Reduction Act was different. So 3 ways that it was different, but one way that it's very similar to earlier environmental policies. The Clean Water Act of 1972, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were huge successes. And the Inflation Reduction Act, as Mike was referring to, played a huge role in spurring investment in manufacturing in the US. And so that was what was starting to overwhelm me and what I started to track with my students. So we've been following investments in clean energy manufacturing in general, and specifically in batteries and electric vehicles for the last 3 years, and tracking this back from the start of the 21st century. And what this slide shows is that there's been substantial investment, 328 projects. But if you focus just on what's happened since the IRA became law in August of 2022, right, we see a significant uptick in investment. So the numbers here show, right, 175 projects, $105 billion in investment, and 105,000 new jobs in the battery and electric vehicle industries. And this is investment that is significant. It's spread around the United States, and it's investment that is putting the U.S. on a track to have a substantial industry around manufacturing both electric vehicles and cars. So our tracking shows, based on the announcements, we could expect in 2030, if all the projects come to fruition, 5.27 million EVs being manufactured per year in the United States, and 893 gigawatt hours of battery capacity, which is actually more than we need to equip all of those cars. Right? We'd have batteries to be used for other applications, whether it's on the grid or backing up power in people's homes. And so, these are the kinds of numbers, right? This is the kind of investment needed to meet the Biden era goals that Mike was showing us during his talk, to have 50% of new cars be EVs by 2030. And so this really represents a new kind of cycle in manufacturing in the United States. And it's manufacturing that's going to places that have been underserved recently in terms of investment. And so when we take our geography and kind of our tracking and we map it onto socioeconomic indicators, what we see is that roughly 3/4 of the jobs, 3/4 of the investment are going to communities that have lower than average median household incomes and have unemployment rates that are higher than average. So really bringing opportunity, jobs, investment to communities that are in need of this opportunity. Of course, a lot of this is going to rural parts of the United States because these are areas that have lots and lots of land, have people who are looking for work, have power infrastructure, which a lot of these big facilities are very concerned with, and often have state, local regulatory agencies that are willing to work with them. And so, and Mike was alluding to this, when you map this onto congressional representation in the United States, it's become well known, the overwhelming majority of the investment since the IRA became law in electric vehicles and battery manufacturing has gone to congressional districts that are represented by Republicans. And just talk a little bit about what this means at the local level. If you look at North Carolina 9, which is the biggest kind of red block, this is where Toyota is just about to commission its $14 billion new battery plant for EVs and hybrids. Or Nevada 2 is the northern half of Nevada, which stretches from Tesla's Gigafactory up to the Lithium Americas project, where they're working on a lithium mine and refinery. In northern Nevada to the third largest there is Georgia 11, which is where Hyundai's Meta plant is located, which has recently gone into production. I think a lot of people, hoped that all of this investment into Republican districts would make a difference at the ballot box last November. That clearly did not work out. And I guess one thing that I think is important here, which I think Mike was alluding to but didn't get to, is that a lot of these jobs are still promised, For a lot of these communities, they're seeing all the construction and infrastructure, kind of the messy part of bringing big factories like this online, and they're not seeing the rewards in terms of tax revenues and jobs where people are actually going to work, That's still a couple of years out. But the hope, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about this, is that this is going to make a difference, having a strong Republican interest in preserving the IRA, but clearly that's complicated going forward. But yeah, so those are a couple of thoughts and a little bit of the tracking we've been doing.
So that's interesting to hear the messy middle as a point of hope, The fact that even if the jobs aren't online right now, the investments that have been created could be well on their way. And I think Deanne Millison, I'd like to introduce you. You're the head of manufacturing policy at Ford Motor Company, one of the companies that is investing in these manufacturing jobs, spurring innovation. How's it going?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for having me. The IRA has been critical to help us with that investment. Ford has made an investment in EVs, not because of the IRA, but well before it, because we want to offer our consumers choice. And that's what we were hearing the most from consumers. And for some consumers, a lot of consumers, particularly global consumers, EVs are the choice for them. They offer a product that has less parts, that may run faster, eventually over the long term will be cheaper, a bunch of benefits that have absolutely nothing to do with the environment, but work for that's the duty cycle that works for them in their lifestyle. And if Ford wants to be a competitive company in the U.S. and globally, it's imperative that we offer a product that consumers want. So that was our motivation behind investing in EVs. And as we were doing that, the Biden administration passed the IRA, which has, as we know, plenty of incentives for EVs for us. And everything that you said, we align with. Ford is we're a part of those charts. We've made investments in Michigan, in Kentucky, in Tennessee, again, many of them in Republican areas. not necessarily for the political reasons, but because for various reasons. One, good elected officials that did want to see these type of investments locally, among other things. And we're still committed to these investments. But it is important. I would be remiss if I didn't say, 45X and to a lesser extent, but also important, 30D are critical for us to maintain these investments. And there's kind of no real way around that. And so we have been really working to ensure that those investments stay in place, even though there's been a change of the administration. And I think one of the things we were discussing before is like where there's some hope as Congress is going through this analysis of what to keep in IRA, what to get rid of, all that. I think there is some hope in that because these are in Republican districts, because these districts haven't had a lot of investment, because these investments are so significant, because there's so many jobs associated with them, not just jobs at the actual plant, but indirect jobs like contributing to the tax base, which helps the hospital, which may be struggling in the area, or that I know Ford's investing in helping to invest in daycare centers or helping with housing, just a ton of indirect jobs and benefits that's coming to these really these communities that are in need. There is hope that we can maintain some of this, that there is some kind of political will to preserve them. And we've seen that in various forms. There's been a couple letters with 13 or more Republicans signing them, mentioning the importance of the tax credits and talking to their colleagues. So that's kind of where our landscape is. That's what we're hopeful about at Ford. And I think as we continue to have these conversations and this discussion, some things that people have said are absolutely true. Like, we don't necessarily have to talk about the environment. We do have to talk about the jobs. We have to go beyond that and talk about the indirect jobs. We have to talk about the types of communities that are being served. On top of that, I know the last panel discussed this. It's competition with China. It's national security. All of that goes into some of our reasonings for doing it in the first place, and so it holds true in why we need to preserve it.
And I think it definitely resonates, the idea that it's not just the jobs, it's not just the indirect jobs, but it's the geography of where those jobs went or where they're intended to go. And Jay, you showed some interesting data to really bring that to life. Although you say Nevada and I say Nevada, but we're not going to argue about that right now. We don't have to have that political war right now. But Catherine Garcia, you run the Clean Transportation for All campaign at Sierra Club, and groups like Sierra Club. I think that ethos of where it's not just jobs, but where the jobs go that matter. It's something that you all advocated for heavily. And so what's it looking like right now? Where are the bright spots? Are there still any?
Yeah, thank you, Artelia. There are bright spots, and I'm excited to share them with you. But in terms of Sierra Club, I want to talk a little bit about why I wake up every day in terms of getting more EVs out on the road, and making sure everyone has access to clean transportation. My campaign's name is Clean Transportation for All, and we're really grounded in that equity and making sure that everyone has access to the most convenient and sustainable ways of getting around. Can I see my slides? Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. No worries. Okay. So just a little grounding in terms of, here we go. I do have this one slide quickly just because Sierra Club was founded out of a love of the outdoors, and this is actually a photo of Yosemite and a charging station there, and with Yosemite in the background. It's particularly beautiful there.
Huge initiative out of the Department of Interior, yes, America the Beautiful.
Yes.
Yep.
So first, just in terms of a dual crises that we're seeing in terms of air pollution and millions of people that do not breathe clean air every single day. According to the American Lung Association, over 131 million people, which is about 40% of Americans, have unhealthy levels of ozone and particle pollution where they live. And this is one of those items which is just so unacceptable. And we are pushing for stronger standards, more investment, and incentives in order to make sure that clean vehicles are more accessible. Okay, and then in terms of climate, many of our members and our supporters at the Sierra Club truly deeply care about addressing the climate crisis. So in terms of my campaign, we are specifically addressing climate emissions, which for the first time in 2017 became the largest source of climate emissions and over electricity, which is remarkable when you think about it, because in 2017, that was actually the point that many experts show that combustion engine cars have started going down in terms of market share, and electric vehicles have started going up from that point, from 2017. So that is a moment, definitely shows that we are moving in the right direction, but we do need to go faster in terms of accelerating adoption of electric vehicles. But here's another glimmer of hope. So one important area that we work in at Sierra Club, and many of our partners work in as well, is making sure that electric utilities are investing in transportation electrification. And this the purple shaded states actually show where there's approved electric utility filings. And I think this is an important thing to show. We will be talking about NEVI a little bit later and the need for more charging infrastructure, but it's really important in that conversation to pair it with what utilities are doing, particularly because as we're talking about grid modernization, as we're talking about making sure that there's more cleaner energy on the grid, this is a real glimmer of hope for making sure that EVs are accessible. So this is showing $6.2 billion have been authorized for spending for transportation electrification, and this is across 35 states. And so with that, I will pass it on.
Yeah, and I think, part of what the point you just ended on is states where the investments are going. And Michael, you're here from one of those purple states, Colorado, the great state of Colorado, where I enjoy hiking in God's country, as certain people would point out. So Colorado has very ambitious climate goals. And how are you guys experiencing the IRA? What are those bright spots, and especially the IIJA?
Yeah, thank you. So like Ford, we have been working to electrify our transportation system before the IRA, before the IIJA. We have what we like to think of as a holistic approach. We try to address the availability of electric vehicles through regulations. We try to address the affordability of electric vehicles through tax incentives and grant programs. Then we try to make them convenient by building public charging so that there's accessible charging for everybody in the state to access. And then we try to leverage all of the co-benefits of electrifying transportation. So modernizing the grid, producing new good-paying jobs, addressing some of the transportation funding shortfalls that exist in our current transportation system with the declining gas tax. And so when the IRA and the IIJA came along, they supercharged a lot of our existing state efforts. We have state funding, we have state policy, we have certain level of state momentum, and the federal support was really helpful over the past few years in infusing those additional funds, helping our consumers access both state and federal benefits, stacking them to make vehicles affordable and more accessible to more people. And as a result, we've seen really great results. We've seen 60,000 new EVs were registered in our state last year. We've surpassed 20 to 25% of market share in certain quarters last year. At one point, we even surpassed California for one brief moment, and we're hoping to get there again.
It was like midnight on a Tuesday.
No, it was quarter three, and we beat them by probably a dozen vehicles. But to play with the big kids like that is impressive for us. So. The federal programs, IRA and IIJA, have really helped us to kind of move into that next level. But we're also confident that, regardless of what happens with those in the future, we have the momentum and we have the policies in place to move forward as a state, even if, we're not getting the same level of support in the next few years.
Yeah, and I think the elephant in the room, and Mike talked about it a little bit as well, is Colorado is not you might be the poster child for climate ambition, but you're not the poster child for EVs. So how are you thinking about some of those barriers or some of those challenges to convincing people that an EV might actually be a choice for them?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, part of the reason why people like hiking and skiing in Colorado is because we have mountains, right?
Right.
We're a mountainous
Big
state.
ones.
We have big mountains. We have wide open plains that people don't always think of when they think of Colorado, but we have rural areas. We have small towns with great distances in between, and it gets cold. But in spite of all those things, EVs actually work very well in Colorado. It's an issue of convincing people, giving them the experience, as Mike said, the personal hands-on experience of, oh, actually this does fit my lifestyle, this does work for me, my neighbors have one, maybe they'll let me try it, maybe I'll rent one, right? And we find that when we give people that information and then we show them there's actually more charging than you think. It's actually more affordable than you think. It might be a good career opportunity for your neighbor or for your child to get into this industry and learn about being a technician or learn about, battery technology, whatever that is. It starts to make sense for people. So having a holistic policy environment and then actively educating people about what is available and why it makes sense, and specifically why it makes sense in Colorado, not taking a campaign from California and New York and kind of transposing it, but saying, this is a Colorado thing. You're a Colorado person. Try it out. You might like it. And we find that gets really great results.
So a person like them might drive an EV, even them, right? Bring it home that way.
Right.
And then I think, we're sort of touching on the issue, but you have this promise, you're starting to convince people, you're starting to see the fruits of the labor, but are you worried, like as the news cycles start taking over, as what we hear and what we read, is that not only is there no more money coming, but it's the money you have could get taken away. How are you experiencing that at the local level? Are you worried about it? Have you made enough progress?
Yeah, so obviously we want to keep access to all the resources we have, right?
You'd like the money to stay?
Right,
Yeah,
right.
okay.
So we're investing our NEVI funds. We've awarded 3 separate rounds of the grant program so far. We're one of the few states that have completed 3 rounds. We're building chargers. We've opened 4 chargers already in Colorado. So of course we want to keep working with those resources. But unlike some other states, we also have state-level funding, state-level resources. We have legislation that created a retail delivery fee. So when people receive Amazon or UPS packages in the mail, there's a tiny fee that comes into that. It then goes to fund chargers, fleet transition, accessibility for e-bikes and other programs. And so we have sustainable funding sources at the state so that we can keep going even if we don't have as much federal money. But of course, we're not going to go as fast. We're not going to be able to do as much as quickly as we would like without those federal resources.
And that's what the ground game looks like in Colorado, right? So you're layering funding sources and you're keeping with the good fight. Catherine, what does the ground game look like for an NGO like Sierra Club or some of our colleagues who are here in the room?
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about why the IRA is so important. So let me take us back a little bit and zoom out and talk a little bit about the IIJA. The IIJA was...
And did everybody even know what that was? It's like, it's sort of, you have these 2 companion pieces of policy, but the one that's getting all the heat and the coverage is the IRA, but the one that's really doing the work is IIJA, right?
Yeah. Well, they're both doing a lot of work.
Exactly.
But I will say the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that one was bipartisan. And it was a moment where we knew we wanted to invest in clean energy. We wanted to get EVs out. We wanted to set up the NEVI program to make sure that all these states had infrastructure. And it was one of those things where I don't think that we would have gotten the IRA without the IIJA. That was really the spark that helped us between the clean energy advocates, the clean transportation advocates, the business community. We all came together, and it was a spark that really prompted a movement. And all of a sudden, we had $391 billion to invest in clean transportation and clean energy, and that moment was incredible to leverage all of the clean energy investments and incentives that we have gotten to see play out over the last couple of years. But just talking a little bit about NEVI, the event we're at really highlights the uncertainty of this moment. And I think that that's a really crucial we did that intentionally because there is some uncertainty around NEVI and what is going to happen, and the funds are frozen. But so many of these states were counting on that funding, and were going through their process, and certainly did not see that these obligated funds that were in place and approved through 2026 would be frozen, would be taken away. And so that's the reality that we're in right now. We are fighting very hard to make sure that those funds are turned back on. We are fighting very hard for members of Congress to see the value of, for the first time ever, to have not only new EV tax credits, but used EV tax credits on a national basis, and for people not to have to wait until they file their taxes. It really opened up making EVs accessible by having the incentive available on the hood, and that dealers actually started getting energized about selling these EVs. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. And not only the tax credits, of course, but really making sure that fleets were able to electrify, more charging infrastructure at businesses or at community centers, and then obviously, of course, all of the incentives for auto manufacturing. So that's a big piece of how we talk about electric vehicles. We make sure that we highlight the savings for families, the reduction in pollution for youth and for the elderly, and for making sure that we're advancing clean energy jobs here in the U.S.
And you're talking about those incentives and the importance of this on the hood term of when you walk into the dealership, you're not going to have to file paperwork and get the rebate later. It comes off the price of the car and brings down the purchase price right away, and how important that is. Jay, what we're experiencing right now is sort of these. You talked about it, the carrots versus the stick, these sort of two different schools of thoughts on how to increase purchasing. And so what do you think about this? Like, how do you, okay, you have to grab a mic.
Yeah, happy to pick that up. And just to echo some of the points that Catherine was making about how important the aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act are that are meant to increase accessibility are. So, including used EVs for the first time. It's just important in terms of expanding opportunities for people, all people, the Uber drivers, right, to be buying EVs and making that part of their transportation plan. But I think, looking forward, and, so much of the conversation now has been, what's happened with funds being frozen right now, and just all of the turmoil here in Washington, D.C., that I think it's been easy to lose sight that, the big question isn't just the funds that have been committed or obligated and whether they're going to be dispersed, but, if you're an auto manufacturer, and, hear
Someone
more,
here is.
Yeah. Right, hear a little bit more about this from Ford. But, the promise of the 30D and especially the 45X, which are the advanced manufacturing tax credits for manufacturing batteries, manufacturing cathodes, all of the components that go into building these cars, those tax credits go through 2032. And, when you look at the pie, right, it's not the funds that have been committed to date in the grants, which have been important, but it's really kind of this question, are those incentives going to be here for the long term? Can manufacturers count on those up and down the supply chain? And in this moment where it's not clear if they're going to stick around or not, are Republicans going to go to bat for this or not? It just leaves a huge cloud hanging over. I do not envy those who have to make 10 million or 100 million or billion-dollar decisions about, with this uncertainty in the policy. So I see a lot of uncertainty too.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head, is like the politics of this are not as cut and dry as they seem to be. So Deanne, are Republicans going to bat for the IRA?
Yeah. I would say, so when I first started, there's been bits and pieces, I would say, of an evolution. You could walk around Congress and Capitol Hill and you'll get people who just are like, I hate EVs. I hate them, period. I want to repeal the IRA. I want nothing to do with this. And I think because of a lot of things, a lot of conversations, a lot of stuff with the chart, where the investments are, I say now I can have conversations about the IRA and talk about it from Ford's perspective. I don't even have to mention EVs. I can just talk about the plants, the jobs, the investments. And then on top of that, like the investments that we have made, you get rid of all of this stuff, that's a sunk cost. You can talk about, the clean energy economy. This is going to go into AI, data centers, which I think Republicans are getting a little more attuned to because of new stakeholders engaging with their party. So there's layers to this, and so you see people move a little bit more. We're not talking about EVs. We don't even have to talk about the plants. So let's say you don't want to talk about EVs, you don't even want to talk about the plants. There's the notion of just what you were saying. You know, it takes us 10 years to do this stuff. These car cycles are like 7 years. We just can't live in a world where companies, manufacturing companies or otherwise, can plan ahead and make investments if every 4 years there's a new set of rules that we have to play by. And so those two things are persuasive. And then if we do talk about EVs, I think we're on good footing to say, you know, we're a global company that we have invested in the United States intentionally. We are aligned with this administration's goals, but we're also a global company. We want to sell our product elsewhere. And if we don't sell it elsewhere, like, we will still exist. Ford is over 100 years old, but we'll be a tiny company. We'll be a small company. And that obviously is not the goal for us, and certainly not for this administration or anyone. So there's so many layers at which you can attack this with political and substantive arguments, and I think it is having some impact. I think you can move past the initial naysayers that are like, I hate EVs, I don't want to talk about this, to, well, I don't care what people drive, and then they're open, their minds open to get it in a little bit more of the weeds. Well, like, who is this helping? And like, what's the China impact of it all? And I think once you get there with various members and you start having those conversations, I think you can make a lot of progress. Now, there's a ton of other stuff at stake outside of EV tax credits, even outside of the IRA and just making a bunch of math work. So I would never, ever pretend like I know the answer to that.
Do the math right now. Let's see it.
But I do think, based on a bunch of the work that everyone's doing, from being able to see some of the impact of these credits right now, from everybody kind of moving past a little bit of the environmental argument, even though it's there, and just talking about other things that are direct for that district or for that state that really resonate with that community, I do think we're making progress.
And, you know, just zooming out, you talked about it a little bit, you know, there's a global economy that Ford is participating in. Over the long haul, do you believe that a push from the government, regulations like the IRA, regulations like IIJA, are they good for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime we can get support, you know, from the government in that way is good for the industry. One of the things we know is that the biggest barriers to EVs are costs and charging. So any help we can get there is always going to be beneficial. But I do think at the end of the day, we're going to have to compete. You can't have support over the long haul. We're just going to have to make a better product. But the truth of the matter is, we're behind. The Chinese are ahead. They have a 10-year head start for various reasons. And we have to catch up. If we're going to compete, we have to be able to catch up and surpass them. And right now, the credits in the IRA help us do that. But further, the back and forth, that hurts us tremendously. Mm-hmm. That means we'll never catch up. Even we just need some rules that we can play by to make long-term investments. And without any durability of policy, it's shooting us in the leg in a race that we have some work to do.
Absolutely. And you know, we've been talking a lot about sort of the first fruits, right? The first fruit are EVs, more EVs on the road, and jobs shortly to follow, right? But what about, like Deanna is talking about, long term? The second fruit of this is that Ford is more competitive globally. OEMs are more competitive globally. How about you, Catherine, from that same perspective? What, if you zoom out, what are the things we should be focusing on, areas that could be an unexpected benefits of these types of investments?
Yeah, so just talking a little bit about, I think it's important to ground this conversation in why we are so focused on making sure we have the policies and incentives and investments to move adoption forward. So one of the things I like to point to, and it's great to have Colorado here represented, is, you know, states have clean air targets. And it's pretty easy to say, this is my target. You know, we want 50% EVs by 2030. That's a target. But let me give you an example. So I have a 5-year-old, and thank you. Yes.
Congratulations, and we're sorry.
Yes,
you must
yes.
be very tired.
Well, so what happens is it's easy for me to say as a mom, 8 o'clock is when we go upstairs. 8 o'clock is when we go upstairs. That's when bedtime starts. Every day, 8 o'clock, everyone is going to move forward. Everyone is going to work together. That is your target. That is your 50% by 2030. It doesn't really work that way. Yeah. Depending on dessert schedule, second dessert, he turns into an Energizer bunny, right? You cannot have an Energizer bunny at 7:45. You will not have a kid upstairs ready for bed. And so this is my example of, like, you need a plan. And for us, the IIJA and the IRA was our plan. That was how we were going to meet our targets. That was how we were going to get to success. And so it's really important to think about how are we going to save these programs? How are we going to talk about the benefits in a way that really centers America and centers our values? And so just to highlight one of the things that Ford is doing, there was this incredible letter 2 weeks ago with all of these companies that have signed on telling the Michigan delegation, we need all of these tax credits. We need all of the incentives. They're so crucial to our business. And so kudos to Ford for getting that letter and all of the partners that supported it. There have been a ton of letters, there have been a ton of meetings, meeting with members of Congress, really knowing our audience and who are the right messengers and how do we get there. And so I think in terms of charging, we've talked about charging infrastructure is a major barrier. We've talked about cost. That's why we have the tax incentives. We're pushing manufacturers to have more affordable EVs. And one of the things that was mentioned, that one of the reasons why Colorado is one of the best states to get an EV is the stacking of incentives. Having utility investment stacked on state incentives, stacked with federal incentives. So I think that's like the perfect strategy to move this forward.
Absolutely. And Michael, picking up on that, that layering effect, what's happening there? What are the benefits that you're able to sort of communicate or people are able to experience because of the investments you're making in EVs?
Yeah, so in our some of our utility areas, we have utility incentives, and then we have our state tax credits. Last year, that was $5,000. It was at point of sale, and then we also had the up to $7,500 federal incentive. There was also an additional $2,500 for a vehicle that was less than $35,000 MSRP. So we were directly incentivizing more affordable EVs as well. And so, a clever consumer could stack all of those things and get a really significant amount of money off of a new vehicle. Of course, there is an educational challenge there. Because of the stackability, that's great, but now you have to understand, 3 or 4 different incentives instead of one that is consistent and universal. And our neighboring states, it's a completely different picture. Mm-hmm. We also have 53 electric utilities, right? 2 of them are investor-owned, so they have programs. The others, it's a patchwork. So just that educational challenge is one of the big ones. I have a 2-year-old, so I'm also working on this.
You're even more sleepless.
Yeah. I was hoping to learn from your plan.
Yeah.
You got a 3-year head start.
Yeah, tell us what happens when the 2-year-old throws a tantrum at 7:45.
Right. So yeah, I think that, all of these programs, when they work well and they work together, they can be more effective. But the fact that they have to be combined and that you're constantly adjusting them and changing them and re-educating your stakeholders, that is a challenge. So I think to the point about that for manufacturing, like if we just have a plan and we know what that plan is and it doesn't change every 6 months or 4 years or whatever, that's going to put us all in a better position. But right now, of course, we just have to adjust to the uncertainty.
Absolutely. And I think you make an important point is like there's so much education that has to happen. And it's like the first step is how do you even get one, right? Like how do you, if you have all these benefits available to you, how do you get it as inexpensively as you can to get it on the road? But I think there's other psychological barriers, and some of them Mike pointed out, some that are real and some that are just perceived until you actually own an EV. And charging is definitely one of them. Deanne, I know this is something that Ford is focusing on and really thinking through. How do you get the consumer into that vehicle? How do you start to address those barriers at the start of the conversation?
Yeah, I would say, like I said in the earlier, the biggest barriers we know are cost and charging. And there was a lot of EV skepticism, I think, when I was first getting into this, and that those two things showed in polling. And with costs, it's 30D is like a significant assistance with that. And I think, all car companies are focused on that and figuring out ways to reduce costs and make their supply chains helpful in that process. With respect to charging, Ford, 80% of people we know public charging is important, but we also know 80% of people charge at home. So we gave out free chargers for a while and have extended that program. So I think for us, it was the idea of like getting past this initial like mental block, because I think it was said, if not on this panel, in the other one, that once people are in the cars, they like the cars, and we had a first mover problem. Like once all the first people that were going to buy EVs anyway bought them, then it looked like the market was shifting, and so now we just have to have a different approach with this second tier in the market. And so those are some of the things that we're doing, is trying to address what we believe are their concerns directly.
Absolutely. And I think this piece on resiliency and how do we create sort of these placeholders for the clean economy in the grid, in the electric vehicles themselves, in the charging infrastructure, and in our manufacturing system are critical. And just, we started out asking, what makes you hopeful? Let's zoom out as we come to a close here. I want each of you to talk a little bit about what you think the long-term strategy is. And even if the IRA goes away tomorrow, what are you focused on? What would you ask our audience to join you in pushing for? Jay? This is your passionate plea to the audience.
Passion plea. And I think, the big messages that we're hearing just about, framing this the right way. And I think if I was going to make one plea, it's just to frame it in terms of international competitiveness. It's about the competitiveness of U.S. companies like Ford, but it's also about the competitiveness of the U.S. and drawing investment and ideas and technology to our country. And if we, miss this moment, we're going to find ourselves, I think on the wrong side of the 21st century and the transportation industry.
I totally agree, which I don't think comes as a surprise to anyone. If I'm being forced to add something new or to layer on, I would say consistency in policy. For a manufacturing company like ours, it really does, it's just a bunch of lost investment if the rules change and we just have to lose. It's lost investment in the plants, it's lost investment in changing our supply chains, but having clear rules of the road and durable policy really helps us invest for the long term.
Two items really quickly. I started off with a presentation that included all the utility investments. One thing to note about the utility investments is that there's been a lot of concern and skepticism on the grid, but by having managed charging, you are actually able to prevent straining on the grid, and actually it applies downward pressure on customer rates. And so having that education is so important on how utilities can be a partner, and utilities do want to see more EVs on the road. They are ingrained partners in this acceleration to EVs. And one other item, this month is actually Earth Month, and one of the programs we do with partners is Drive Electric Earth Month. There are over 100 events across the country all month. So I encourage you to go to Drive Electric Earth Month. And to Mike Murphy's point, so much of this work is about word of mouth. And so that is an opportunity to have these community events, to talk to EV drivers, talk about what it's like driving in your community. And it's a great event.
So we heard a few points about the importance of global competitiveness, and I think that is really critical. But from the state perspective, I also want to bring it down to the local community. Governor Polis used an analogy recently that I really liked, In Colorado, we have a lot of aspen trees, and aspen trees look like they're all individual units, but actually underground, the root systems are connected. And so when we think about affordability, sustainability, livability, health, economic opportunity, all these things are tied together below the surface. And I think that if we talk about the transportation system in that context, it makes a lot more sense for more people how it connects to their real lives. So I leave that with the group.
Excellent close. And with that, we're going to shift to the global view in China, and I'd like to welcome Caitlin.